So one would usually think of science as that singular arena in which differences of perspective are handled in a cool, dispassionate, and civil fashion. Researchers gather empirical evidence, they test their hypotheses using commonly accepted methodologies, and they make corrections as fresh information or more plausible explanations emerge. Science operates on the basis of provisional truths, and thus requires its practitioners to maintain an open mind. One would suppose then that there would be little tolerance for the sort of stubborn rectitude and partisan sniping that have become a commonplace in our politics and in our culture at large. Alas, it turns out that even highly regarded members of this empirically oriented community sometimes succumb to this all too human failing. Take, for instance, the ongoing debate over what killed off the dinosaurs. Was it the sudden impact of a 6-mile-wide asteroid plummeting into the Yucatan? Or was it perhaps a centuries-long series of climate-altering volcanic eruptions in central India? Was it a combination of both? The first theory has held sway for several decades now, and its leading proponent, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Luis Alvarez, has defended his thesis stridently and at times pugnaciously. Alvarez, as Bianca Booker reported recently in the Atlantic magazine, has disparaged his dissenting colleagues as, quote, not very good scientists who publish, quote, scientific nonsense. Confronted with suggestive and potentially disconfirming evidence from the fossil record, Alvarez offered this condescending rejoinder. Paleontologists, he sniffed, are more like stamp collectors than real scientists. This kind of denigration, practiced by a person of significant scientific stature, has had an untoward effect. Some dissenters from the dominant position have simply quit the field entirely, afraid of being embarrassed by Alvarez or jeopardizing their careers in higher education. And thus, Bianca Booker writes, the sudden impact theory solidified and alternative theories were largely abandoned, but not completely. For tough-minded researchers like Princeton's Gerta Keller, some at least have refused to fold. The more people like Alvarez attack me, she told Booker, the more I want to find out what the real story is behind it. Now, to be sure, such skirmishes in the world of science are mild and, fortunately, comparatively rare, at least in comparison to what we've been witnessing in the larger culture. These days, differences of opinion and perspective quickly degrade into ad hominem attacks and, where the mandating of face masks is concerned, sometimes direct physical assault. And as a result, we are threatened with the loss of any sense of shared vision or common purpose, even on an issue as elementary as public health and safety. Now, one would think that as American citizens, our needs and interests would converge at certain points, but identifying those convergences has become more and more difficult. Trust between and among Americans has suffered serious erosion, compromising our ability to communicate with each other or to coordinate our efforts except in a state of dire emergency. Now, as we all know, there's been no shortage of commentary on this subject in recent months and years. And much of that commentary, like UW-Madison academic Kathy Kramer's book, The Politics of Resentment, much of that commentary has focused on the feelings that Americans in rural and small-town residents harbor. It's gotten downright nasty around here, Kramer observed in her book about outstate Wisconsin. People, she writes, in casual conversation are treating each other as enemies. This is a place where people are notoriously nice, seriously nice. But times have changed. They certainly have. And in this respect, Wisconsin is hardly exceptional. Kathy Kramer contends that Wisconsin's political movers and shakers have played a leading role in fostering and fomenting this cleavage between and among us. The seeds of this have been sown over long periods of time, she writes, and the political elites reap the benefits of the divisiveness that they themselves have helped to create. And so the Donald Trump phenomena is simply the Wisconsin experience writ large and shorn of all pretense. Now, both before and during his occupancy of the White House, Mr. Trump reveled in the incivility and the trash talk that have long been his stock in trade. At one rowdy rally during the 1916 campaign, the candidate, Mr. Trump, encouraged the crowd to root out and expel any dissenters among them, which they gladly did, to the chant of USA, USA. And Mr. Trump, responding to that chant, said, "Isn't this more fun than a regular boring rally? To me," he says, "this is fun." Well, I promise not to belabor the Trump experience during this discourse. But the truth is that Mr. Trump anticipated and he found a receptive audience for his demagoguery, or what his admirers call his tell-it-like-it-is bravado. So the culture has been shifting, coarsening, and we may not have yet seen the worst of it. Liliana Mason is a professor of government and politics at the University of Maryland. She's been watching the trend line for quite some time. She does not like the direction in which it's headed. "I am worried," she writes, "about violent conflict across party lines. I haven't seen anything stopping that outcome yet." That was 2.5 years ago. And of course, since that time, a belligerent mob descended on and breached our nation's capital. And so more than one historian has observed that our country has not been so deeply divided, at least since before the Civil War. Internecine conflict has always been prominent in Americans' relationships with one another, politically, religiously, and culturally. That goes without saying. But it did not always translate into the kind of rhetorical excess that we've been seeing lately. Consider, for instance, the run-up to the 2000 presidential election, 2000, 21 years ago. Commenting on the Republican primary debate that was held that summer, the summer of 2000, Harper Magazine editor Lewis Lapham groused that there was nary a sharp comment or challenging question uttered the entire evening. All 6 contestants in that debate, he wrote, clearly wanted to be seen as nice guys, and they were careful not to insult one another or give way to wild or angry words. 2 decades ago. Now, what is happening today may seem to many of us unprecedented, but by historical standards, perhaps it's not. Both before and during his presidency, Abraham Lincoln endured a steady stream of abuse from the press, the pulpit, even from his fellow Republicans. One prominent New York City Republican attorney likened Abraham Lincoln to a baboon, a yahoo, a gorilla. The celebrated preacher Henry Ward Beecher offered this rebuke of the president: "He is an unshapely man, lacking in refinement." The well-born George McClellan, commanding general of the Union Army, voiced the opinion that his superior, the president, was a coward and an idiot. During the McCarthy era, red baiting threatened the livelihood of teachers, novelists, screenwriters, scientists, labor leaders, civil servants, as well as public office holders. And those so charged by Mr. McCarthy were guilty until proven innocent, and often a mere accusation sufficed to heap disrespect on the person so targeted, destroying their career. Now, one might imagine that religious leaders would show greater restraint in their speech, serve as models of brotherly and sisterly affection. Unfortunately, that's not always been the case either. Read the records of the early church sometime. I just finished a book entitled Christianity, the First 1,000 Years. And in that book and many others, you will find priests and bishops fulminating against their theological rivals. Martin Luther, instigator of the Protestant Reformation, was quick to pin the label Antichrist, meaning a human agent of the devil, on all of his opponents, whether sacred or secular. You know, even the Gospels are less helpful in this regard than one might hope. Now, to be sure, Jesus did counsel his followers to love their enemies, and if offended, to turn the other cheek. At one point, he also inveighs against hateful speech, declaring that anyone who says, "You fool," is inviting hellfire. But sadly, the Gospels are hardly consistent on this matter, as well as so many others. Because elsewhere, Jesus himself berates his opponents as blind fools, vipers, hypocrites. He says, "Don't bother casting your pearls before such swine." So it seems then that incivility has enjoyed a long and lamentable track record throughout the ages. And so here now is the perennial challenge we are asked to face. Can we create a culture of healthy partisanship, a partisanship free of the felt need to demonize our opponents? It is not an insignificant issue. And as the parable that I related earlier, as the children's story you heard earlier tell us, our words do matter, and they matter a great deal. 90 years ago, the great American educator and philosopher John Dewey warned that a democracy that has lost the art of public communication is a democracy on its way toward chaos. So before entertaining possible remedies, it might help if we had a better handle on the etiology of this particular social illness. What forces have been at work in the larger culture, sowing discord, normalizing this incendiary discourse? With a firmer grasp on the sources of this malady, then perhaps we are in a better position to discuss some possible ways in which they can be mitigated. Well, there seems to have been, in the first place, a general loosening of standards in the vernacular. Some of us are old enough to remember George Carlin's seminal stand-up comedy sketch entitled 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television. Now, Carlin introduced this stand-up sketch in 1972, when the Television Code of Broadcasting still imposed strict limits on what can be said or displayed in the public airways. And so profanity, sexual innuendo, irreverence, graphic violence, negative depictions of family life, all of these transgressed the bounds of common decency, and thus, in 1972, they were suppressed. Needless to say, once the Code of Broadcasting was abolished in 1983, things began to change. Now, at first, producers tread rather cautiously, gingerly, but over time, George Carlin's 7 words crept into the mainstream, and they have staked their claim in popular music, film, television, and even casual conversation. And so the long and short of it is that many of us are less cautious, less careful these days about the language we use, the way we express ourselves, especially on platforms like the internet that afford us both a sense of security and, if we choose, anonymity. Even here in the upper Midwest, where politeness has long stood as a cardinal virtue, we are, I'm afraid, less circumspect than we once were. And it's also true that we may be more easily provoked than in the past, and thus more given to this incivility. Some of this, and especially with respect to political issues, has to do with the transformation of our politics into what we call a zero-sum game. Either you win or you lose. Either you're for me or you're against me. An epithet that Donald Trump frequently employed to dismiss his critics was, "You're a loser." And he had a habit of describing his own achievements, such as they were, as big wins or even humongous wins. Now, the substance of those wins didn't seem to matter too much as long as the president believed that he came out on top. And as a larger-than-life figure, Mr. Trump reinforced and reflected what has become a commonly held sentiment. We live in a society where it's all about the will to power, the will to dominate, the will to conquer, Cornel West recently observed. And as a result, he says, we no longer have dialogues. We just have intersecting monologues. Now, this is not a phenomenon that is confined to our politics. As Red Sanders, the former head football coach of UCLA, famously declared, "Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing," a line that is often falsely attributed to Vince Lombardi. And winning matters a great deal, not only on the football field, but to a scientist like Luis Alvarez, or to a predatory capitalist like Chicago's Paul Singer, or Tesla's Elon Musk. And as an outlook, this just feeds the fires of resentment. Many of the people in rural and small-town Wisconsin that Kathy Kramer interviewed for his book, they felt that their communities were losing in the struggle for attention and power and resources. Urban dwellers, these rural folk complained, were prospering at their expense, even though the data simply didn't confirm those accusations. But as Kathy Kramer writes, it's perceptions, not the data, that matters. And politicians exploit these sentiments, and the media has also been complicit. Too much poll-driven political coverage focuses on who's winning and who's losing at any given moment. And this only raises the emotional stakes as voters overinvest in the candidate of their choice. Liliana Mason says we need to tone down all of this winning versus losing. We need to focus instead on what government is supposed to do as opposed to who is going to win the latest skirmish. Zero-sum politics can also be subversive, as we recently have discovered, because those who lose end up questioning the legitimacy of the outcome and the fairness of the system itself. Today, better than half of all card-carrying Republicans are absolutely convinced that the last election was stolen and that Joe Biden has usurped the presidency. More than 50% of all registered Republicans believe that. This does not bode well for our future as a country. And furthermore, the increasing tendency for Americans to self-sort into groups whose moral narratives match their own, that only serves to harden their positions. And whether these groups assume the form of online communities or a coffee klatch at the local Denny's, such collectives reinforce the members' sense of righteousness and dispel their doubts. Our politics is groupish, Jonathan Haidt writes, and when we strongly identify with a particular group, its enemies become our enemies. This groupishness exacerbates that zero-sum game. For the stronger the connection between and among the members, the closer the identification, the harder it becomes to recognize outsiders as anything more than enemies who are governed by evil intent. As the political scientist Jeremy Sumi notes in his book, The Impossible Presidency, that's a great name, The Impossible Presidency, I'm sure Joe Biden would agree. Today's rabid partisanship, he says, defines compromise as the appeasement of evil, and thus it precludes any kind of collaboration. Okay, so what is to be done? If we find the current state of affairs to be dangerous, untenable, are there strategies we can adopt that might improve our political and cultural climate? Well, the obvious first step is to make an effort to step outside of our comfort zone. doesn't mean turning the channel to Fox and Friends. It's about physical presence. It's about inviting face-to-face interaction with some folks who don't necessarily share our moral or cultural narrative. So for instance, and I have mentioned this in one of my previous visits here, a couple of years ago, before I retired, I started attending a Black Baptist church on my free Sunday mornings. Now, why did I do that? Because it occurred to me over a period of time that I had not had sufficient exposure to Madison's African-American community, and so I really didn't appreciate what their concerns were, what their fears and their hopes were. And so I began to visit this particular congregation. And I went there simply to walk in the door, sit quietly, usually near the back, listen closely, and experience for myself the discomfort of being both white and non-Christian in a place where devout people of color defined the faith and made the rules. As Kathy Kramer discovered after repeated visits to some Northwoods communities here in Wisconsin, encounters like that help to restore our trust in each other and to soften the hard shell of our assumptions. And that eventually can lead to what the sociologist Peter Berger calls cognitive contamination. And what that means is a greater receptivity to foreign points of view, cognitive contamination. And when this occurs, Berger says, it becomes increasingly difficult to characterize the beliefs of others as perverse, insane, or evil. Step out of your comfort zone. And so in closing, a few other suggestions that might help to improve the quality of our conversations, especially those that we are drawn into with people with competing viewpoints. First, think like a good scientist, not like Luis Alvarez, who I quoted from earlier. Thinking like a good scientist means holding on to one's convictions lightly. Learning to be comfortable with provisional or tentative rather than final truths. Understand that there is much value in not knowing, as much value in not knowing as there is in knowing. As Harvard entomologist E.O. Wilson advises, don't be afraid to use words and phrases that denote timid uncertainty. Use phrases and words like, well, apparently, or seemingly. That raises the possibility of, it could well be. This is not sloppiness, Wilson assures us. It's just good professional conduct and true to the core of the scientific method. Following his lead, we could all profit from a little more intellectual humility as we try to engage others in challenging conversation. Second, and related to the foregoing, be curious. And that means become more comfortable with asking questions rather than sharing our convictions. Listen carefully to what you hear when you ask a question. As the 20th century playwright Eugene Ionesco once said, it's not the answer that enlightens, it's the question. And I have found that people are much more receptive to being asked rather than being told. Not interrogated, mind you, but just queried in a way that suggests that you are genuinely curious about what that other person thinks and why they think that way. Third, be patient. Or as the Dalai Lama once said, be forbearing. The Tibetan word for forbearing or patience is sopa, and it denotes the ability to sit with our discomfort and uncertainty until we have achieved a greater measure of clarity. It takes time to establish a rapport, much less a meeting of minds. And thus we need to be patient, cultivating a relationship and not just a conversation. It's not about winning the argument. It's about instilling a degree of mutual support. Fourth, cultivate self-awareness, greater mindfulness. As an interviewer, Kathy Kramer kept track of her body language when she was sitting at a table with other people in a coffee house or in a little cafe in the North Woods. And she said that I found that when I would fold my arms, that signified to my listeners defensiveness, withdrawal. She also became much more aware of other mannerisms that betrayed her biases, and she strove to avoid them. Tone is important. Is your tone inviting? Is it friendly? Or is it aggressive and challenging? Because the words themselves will hardly register if there is even a hint of disapproval in one's inflection. In his teachings, the Buddha admonished his followers to practice right or skillful speech as a spiritual discipline. Such speech, he said, is truly noble, is untainted, elevated, guided by compassion. It is a crucial element on the path that leads to eternal bliss. As a society, we have become rather lazy and undisciplined in our speech. And so following the Buddha's advice, well, that takes some doing. And so my last point is this: we need to practice. We need to strive to become more mindful in our everyday discourse with colleagues, with customers, with family members, with students, with members of our own tribe, as it were. Chances are that we have all been affected to some degree by today's toxic talk. So we are long overdue for a refresher course in simple civility. This work is very hard to do, Liliana Mason admits, but it might just be the kind of work that saves the Republic and restores our sense of community. May it be so.